Chapter 10, Crosshairs. Part 1, A Shadow Over the Lot. Summary: as Tyrone goes about his day at King of Five, the shadows of his past close in, and Charles senses trouble on the horizon. The sun was high and harsh, but the air felt different. Tyrone was out on the lot, tightening straps on a shipment, his focus sharp as usual, but something gnawed at the edges of his mind. A pressure, a presence. Inside the shop, drivers buzzed in and out, finishing their routes and joking over the usual lunchtime chatter. Then Reggie walked in, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag, his face pulled tight with unease. "Yo, Chuck," Reggie called out toward the office, his voice lower than usual. "You see them fools lurking out front earlier?" Charles looked up from the desk, eyes sharp under his cap. "What fools?" he asked, his voice calm but already hardening. Reggie shot a glance toward Tyrone, then back to Charles. "Couple cats in a black Tahoe. Parked across the street. Ain't buying nothing, just sitting there watching this place," Reggie said, his tone uneasy. "Tatted up." Florencia looked. The words hit like a hammer. Tyrone's breath hitched, his grip tightening around the straps he'd been working with, the blood draining from his face. Charles' eyes flicked toward him, calm but piercing. "You recognize him?" Charles asked, though his tone made it sound more like a statement than a question. Tyrone didn't answer right away, his heart pounding in his ears, but Charles already knew. His voice dropped low, meant only for Tyrone. "You ain't invisible, son," Charles said, his words quiet but heavy, slicing right to the bone. "You've been doing good, but some folks don't let go easy." Tyrone nodded once, jaw clenched tight. He felt it in his gut. The streets weren't done with him yet. End of part 1. Final line to echo in next part. The streets weren't done with him yet. Chapter 10, Crosshairs Part 2, The Message. Summary: the inevitable strikes. Tyrone's old life takes Marie as leverage, forcing him into a brutal choice that will change everything. The streets weren't done with him yet. Tyrone's steps were quick, his nerves tight as wire as he walked home after his shift, every sound behind him pulling his eyes to the corners. Engines idling too long, shadows shifting near alleyways. He knew that feeling. He'd lived in it before, and it was back. By the time he got near his block, the pit in his stomach had grown deep. He kept his head down, hands in his pockets, but his mind was racing. He needed to get home. He needed to see Marie. His phone buzzed, blocked number. He froze on the sidewalk, staring at the screen. Then he answered, his voice low but sharp. "Yeah?" There was no static, just a voice, chilling, calm, too familiar. "Bones." "Even in Tyrone," Bones said, his tone smooth like they were catching up over drinks. "You know why I'm calling." Tyrone's blood went cold. His voice stayed steady, but his breath caught as he spoke. "Where's Marie?" Tyrone demanded, already knowing what was coming. Bones chuckled softly, no rush in his words. "She's safe for now," Bones said. "But you? You've been slipping, my boy." Tyrone's legs felt locked in place, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "Don't touch her," Tyrone growled, every word laced with heat. Bones let out a slow, amused sigh. "You should have stayed where you belong, Tyrone," Bones said, his voice darkening. "But since you didn't, we taken what you love. That's the game." Tyrone's heart pounded, sweat beating down his neck. "What do you want?" Tyrone asked, though he already knew the answer. Bones' voice dropped lower, sharper. "You," Bones said, "alone, midnight. I'll send the spot. You show up clean or she don't walk out." Click. The line went dead. Tyrone stood there, the city moving around him like he wasn't even there, his body frozen but his mind racing. Then his phone buzzed again, a message, an address, industrial district, warehouse, midnight. His hands trembled, not from fear but from fury. He had no choice, but he wasn't walking into it blind. End of part 2. Final line to echo in next part, but he wasn't walking into it blind. Ready for me to continue with part 3, the call for help? Chapter 10, Crosshairs Part 3, the call for help. Summary: with no time to spare, Tyrone turns to the only man he trusts, Charles. He comes clean about everything, and Charles makes it clear this rescue comes with a steep price. But he wasn't walking into it blind. Tyrone moved fast, cutting through the streets like a shadow, his heartbeat thudding hard in his ears, but his mind cold and locked in. There wasn't anyone else to call. He headed straight back to King of Five, the lot already dark, the last truck's gone, the office windows glowing faint behind the fence. Charles was still there, just like Tyrone knew he would be. Tyrone didn't knock. He pushed the door open, stepping into the quiet hum of the shop. Charles sat at his desk, working under the lamp's low light, glasses perched on the edge of his nose, calm as ever. But the second Tyrone stormed in, Charles looked up, reading everything in his face before a single word was spoken. "You're in trouble," Charles said, setting his pen down slowly. Tyrone's chest heaved as he stood in the doorway, fists tight at his sides. "They took Marie," Tyrone said, his voice clipped, all air stripped from it. Florencia. Charles didn't react, not with panic, not with shock. He just sat back in his chair, staring at Tyrone like he was weighing every ounce of him in that moment. "And now you need help," Charles said, his words flat, steady. Tyrone didn't flinch. "I need her back," Tyrone said, his voice hard. "I don't care what happens to me." Charles studied him for a long, heavy beat. Then, slow and deliberate, Charles stood from his chair and walked to the filing cabinet in the corner. He unlocked the bottom drawer, sliding it open. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was a pistol, heavy, worn but clean, beside it a short shotgun. Charles unwrapped them both, his movements smooth, practiced. "You know what happens after this?" Charles asked, loading shells into the shotgun without looking at him. "You don't get to come back here. You don't get to clock out and unload trucks no more." Tyrone's voice didn't waver. "I ain't asking to come back," he said. Charles finally looked at him then, eyes sharp but not angry, just real. "You sure about that?" Charles asked, sliding the last shell in with a soft click. "Once you pick this life up again, it sticks. You don't put it back down." Tyrone's jaw clenched, his voice hard but steady. "I ain't letting them take my family," Tyrone said. "If this is the price, I'll pay it." Charles stared at him, then gave a small, grim nod, almost like respect, almost like regret. "Then let's get her back," Charles said. He handed Tyrone the pistol, heavy and cold in his palm. Tyrone's hands didn't shake. He was past shaking now. End of part 3. Final line to echo in next part, he was past shaking now. Chapter 10, Crosshairs Part 4, Into the Wolves' Den. Summary: Tyrone and Charles head into the trap, armed and ready. Inside, they face Bones, Lil Ghost, and Spooky in a tense standoff with Marie caught in the middle. He was past shaking now. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows shattered and boarded up, the metal walls tagged with layers of graffiti, some old, some fresh warnings sprayed in Florencia blue. Tyrone and Charles sat in the truck outside, engines off. The only sounds their steady breathing and the faint hum of the city beyond. Tyrone's knuckles were white around the pistol, his jaw locked tight. Charles chambered the last round into the shotgun, his face unreadable in the dark. "You remember what I said," Charles muttered, his voice low, eyes forward. "Once we step in, there's no halfway." Tyrone gave a tight nod. "I remember." They got out in silence. Their boots hit the pavement slow but steady. No words needed as they moved toward the rusted side entrance Bones had texted Tyrone earlier. Charles took the lead, shotgun low but ready. Tyrone followed, heart steady, every step measured. Inside, the warehouse was wide open, empty except for broken pallets and trash scattered across the floor. And them. Bones stood near the back wall, calm as ever, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Lil Ghost paced nearby, twitchy and wired, gun tucked at his side. Spooky lingered near Marie, who sat on the cold ground, wrists tied, mouth gagged, her eyes wild with fear but locked on Tyrone the second he stepped inside. Her stomach was showing more now under her sweatshirt, her hands shaking against the ropes. Tyrone's chest twisted at the sight, but he kept walking, slow and deliberate, his gun loose in his grip but ready. Charles followed, the shotgun cradled like an extension of his arms. Bones' smile was cold and sharp, like a knife drawn slow across skin. "Look at this," Bones said, his voice smooth, amused. "Family reunion." Tyrone's eyes stayed locked on Marie as he spoke, his voice low but hard as stone. "Let her go." Bones laughed lightly, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "Not yet," Bones said. "We got business." Charles's voice cut through, calm but carrying weight. "You think this ends how you want it to?" Charles asked, his shotgun never wavering. "You're playing a game you too young to finish." Lil Ghost's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Bones held up a lazy hand, stopping him. "Nah," Bones said, still smiling. "Ain't no need for rushing. We all here now." He turned his eyes back to Tyrone, the grin fading just enough to reveal the truth underneath. "You broke the code, homie," Bones said, his voice darker now. "You walked away." Tyrone's voice didn't waver. "I walked towards something better." Bones' smile dropped entirely, his face hard now. "Ain't no better for people like us," Bones said flatly. "You either stay in or you get buried." Silence thickened, heavy enough to choke. Charles shifted slightly, eyes never leaving Bones. "You got two choices," Charles said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "Let her go and we all walk out. Or you find out how far I'll go to protect what's mine." Bones chuckled again, but there was a flicker in his eyes, uncertainty. "You old fools still think this city plays by your rules," Bones sneered. Charles's face didn't move. "It plays by whoever survives," Charles said. Tension coiled tight as wires between them, nobody moving, nobody breathing. Then, faster than anyone could blink, Charles made his move. End of part 4, final line to echo in next part. Then, faster than anyone could blink, Charles made his move. Chapter 10, Crosshairs Part 5, Fire and Smoke. Summary: in a brutal explosion of violence, Charles fires first, shattering the standoff. Tyrone fights to save Marie, and together they barely escape the warehouse alive. Then, faster than anyone could blink, Charles made his move. The shotgun roared. The blast ripped through the warehouse, deafening and violent. Spooky didn't even get to scream. He dropped instantly, his body thrown back in a spray of blood and smoke. Everything erupted. Lil Ghost dove for cover, firing wild shots as he scrambled, bullets cracking through the air. Bones swung his pistol toward Charles, but Charles was already moving, firing another blast that blew apart a stack of crates, sending shards flying. Tyrone didn't hesitate. While the gunfire thundered around him, he charged toward Marie, dropping low, using the chaos to his advantage. Another shot rang out. Lil Ghost's bullet nicked Charles, tearing through his shoulder, but Charles didn't flinch. He kept firing, every shot deliberate, every step forward steady. Tyrone reached Marie fast, his heart slamming in his chest as he grabbed her, dragging her behind a metal beam. Her eyes were wide with terror, muffled cries spilling from behind the gag. "Hold on," Tyrone panted, ripping the ropes from her wrists with shaking hands. Another shot cracked past him, sparking against the beam inches from his head. Bones' voice rang out over the gunfire, sharp and furious. "Kill 'em both." Tyrone freed Marie's hands, yanking the gag away. "Run when I say," Tyrone growled, his breath ragged but focused. Marie nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, but her eyes locked on his. Charles let out another blast. Lil Ghost screamed, clutching his leg as he dropped behind a crate, his gun clattering away. Tyrone gritted his teeth, adrenaline flooding every nerve in his body. "Now!" he shouted. He grabbed Marie's hand and bolted, keeping low as they sprinted across the warehouse floor. Bullets chased them, Bones' shots wild but deadly, but Charles moved in behind them, covering their escape with steady, relentless fire. The exit loomed ahead, glowing like salvation through the smoke. They burst through the door together, stumbling into the cool night air, lungs burning, bodies shaking. Behind them, another gunshot cracked out, then silence. Tyrone didn't stop running. He kept Marie close, dragging her toward the truck, blood roaring in his ears. Only when they reached the cab did he finally stop, turning back to see Charles emerge from the shadows, bleeding from his shoulder but still standing, his shotgun hanging loose in his grip. Charles locked eyes with Tyrone across the distance. No words, no need. They'd survived. Barely. Tyrone pulled Marie into his arms, holding her tight as she sobbed against his chest, her body shaking but alive. And in that moment, surrounded by smoke, sirens in the distance, hearts pounding in their ears, Tyrone knew nothing would ever be the same again. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11, Ashes and Embers, Part 1, Wounds and Warnings. Summary: Tyrone and Charles quietly tended their wounds in the aftermath of the shootout. Charles gives Tyrone one final warning. This was the last time he'd ride for him. The air was thick with smoke and sirens, even long after they'd left the warehouse behind. Tyrone sat at the edge of his bed, shirt stripped off, a deep scrape running down his side from the broken glass, his knuckles raw and bruised. He barely noticed the sting as he wiped the blood away with a rag soaked in rubbing alcohol. Across the room, Marie sat in silence, wrapped in a blanket, her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't said much since they'd gotten back, her face pale, her eyes distant, but she hadn't left his side either. Tyrone glanced at her as he worked, his heart twisting with guilt that had no words. At the same time, across town, Charles stood in his dim kitchen, stripping off his shirt with slow, deliberate movements. His shoulder was torn and bleeding, the wound deep but clean enough to patch. He poured whiskey straight over it without flinching, his jaw tight as he worked the needle and thread through his skin like he'd done it 100 times before. In the background, the sounds of his house were faint, kids asleep, a faint hum of a TV from another room. But Charles was alone in that moment. Focused, methodical. When he finished stitching himself up, he poured a glass of that same whiskey and sat down at the table, cradling it in one hand as he stared out the window into the night. After a while, his phone buzzed. He let it ring twice before answering. "You good?" Tyrone's voice asked, quiet but steady. Charles didn't answer right away. Then he spoke, calm but sharp as ever. "You ain't gonna call me again after this," Charles said, his words slicing clean through the quiet. "This was your last ride with me. I meant that." Tyrone's breath caught, but he didn't argue. He knew. "You got lucky tonight," Charles continued, his voice harder now. "But luck don't last. Not in this life." Silence hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Then Charles finished his drink, his voice low but final. "You got one shot to build something real now, Reed," Charles said. "You stay in this fire, you gonna burn. You step out, maybe, just maybe, you make it." Tyrone swallowed hard, those words sitting like lead in his chest. Charles didn't wait for a reply. He hung up, leaving Tyrone sitting there, phone in hand, heart pounding in his chest. In the other room, Marie shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter but still watching him. Tyrone stared at the phone for a long time. He already knew what had to happen next. End of part 1. Final line to echo in next part. He already knew what had to happen next. Chapter 11, Ashes and Embers, Part 2, Father and Daughter. Summary: Santiago visits Marie after hearing about the kidnapping. His anger slowly gives way to reluctant respect for Tyrone, even if he can't fully say it aloud. He already knew what had to happen next. The morning came slow, heavy with leftover smoke and the ache of everything that couldn't be undone. Tyrone stayed quiet, barely speaking as he watched over Marie, who hadn't slept much at all. Her body stayed curled tight under the blanket, her face pale but calmer than the night before, too drained to cry, too tired to fight. Then there was a knock at the door. Tyrone stood without hesitation, the weight in his chest already telling him who it would be. When he opened it, Santiago stood on the other side. His face was tight, jaw clenched, his eyes burning not with fresh anger, but with something deeper, older, fear maybe, regret. Pride wrapped too tightly around both. He didn't speak at first, just stared at Tyrone, taking in the bruises, the busted knuckles, the exhaustion carved deep in his face. Then, with a quiet, rough voice, Santiago spoke. "I want to see my daughter." Tyrone stepped aside, letting him in without a word. Santiago walked in, his heavy work boots thudding against the old wood floors, and paused in the living room where Marie sat, wrapped in the blanket, her eyes lifting as she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Santiago moved closer, lowering himself into the chair across from her, his voice rough but quiet. "You all right?" he asked, his words stiff. Marie gave a weak nod, her voice soft. "I'm fine, Papa," she said, though her voice still trembled. Santiago let out a slow breath, his hands gripping his knees tight. "I should have protected you better," he muttered, almost too low to hear. Marie's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the words. But Santiago didn't look up. He stayed staring at the floor, his voice gruff but honest. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, his words thick with something like guilt. "Putting distance between you and him, being hard, keeping you away from trouble." He finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with her, softening just enough to let the weight show. But he didn't run, Santiago admitted. Not when it mattered. The air in the room shifted, heavier but no longer suffocating. Marie's eyes filled with something close to relief, but she said nothing. Santiago looked back toward Tyrone now, his stare steady, the fire in his voice dimmed but still smoldering. "I still don't like you," Santiago said plainly, the words rough but without venom. "But maybe I respect you now." Tyrone didn't flinch, didn't puff his chest or smirk. He just nodded once, steady, quiet, the way a man accepts something earned. Santiago stood, his shoulders heavy, his voice softer, as he glanced toward Marie again. "You better take care of her," Santiago warned. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was a plea wrapped in pride. Tyrone's answer was simple. "I will." Santiago gave him a last hard look, then left. No more words, no slamming doors, just quiet steps fading down the hallway. And in the silence that followed, something in the room felt different, like maybe, for the first time, it wasn't broken anymore. End of part 2. Final line to echo in next part. Like maybe, for the first time, it wasn't broken anymore. Chapter 11, Ashes and Embers, Part 3, A Man's Decision. Summary, Tyrone reflects on everything he's endured and makes a final decision about his future. He returns to Charles to settle the score, but Charles surprises him with something unexpected. Like maybe, for the first time, it wasn't broken anymore. Later that night, after the house had gone still again, Tyrone sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights outside the window. Marie was asleep on the couch, fondly resting, her breathing soft and steady as she clutched a pillow tight against her stomach. Tyrone watched her from across the room, his thoughts heavy but clear. The streets, the gang, the near-death moments, it all felt distant now, like a bad dream that hadn't fully faded, but the weight of it was still here, in his bruised hands, in the cuts on his ribs, in the quiet air between them. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the pistol Charles had given him, laying it on the table in front of him. Cold, heavy, ugly, but not what he wanted to carry anymore. His decision wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The next morning, with the sun barely up, Tyrone knocked on the back door of King of Five. Charles opened it, already dressed, a cup of black coffee in hand, his face unreadable as he looked at Tyrone, standing there with the pistol wrapped in a towel. Tyrone held it out without a word. Charles stared at it, then at Tyrone. "You sure?" Charles asked, his voice low but not mocking, genuinely asking. Tyrone's voice didn't waver. "I'm sure." Charles took it, setting it on the counter without ceremony, then motioned for Tyrone to come inside. Tyrone followed, the shop quiet in the early morning haze. They sat across from each other in the small break room, the smell of coffee thick in the air. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Charles leaned back, his eyes calm but sharp. "You did what you had to do," Charles said, his voice even. "Ain't no shame in that." Tyrone nodded, but didn't speak. Charles studied him a beat longer, then added, his tone shifting slightly. "You ready to do something different now?" Charles asked. Tyrone's gaze lifted, cautious but open. Charles took a sip of his coffee, then set the mug down and leaned forward slightly. "I ain't got many years left in this," Charles said plainly. "Kid's getting older. Wife been on me to slow down." He paused, letting the words sink in. But I ain't about to hand this over to just anybody, Charles continued, his voice steady but serious. But you showed something I ain't seen in a long time. Tyrone's brows knit, caught off guard by the shift in tone. Charles didn't flinch. I can help you get a truck, Charles said. Set you up right. You handle it, you own it. Tyrone's heart kicked hard in his chest, but his face stayed still. You serious? Tyrone asked, his voice low but edged with disbelief. Charles gave a slight smirk, the first flicker of it in days. I don't play with business, Charles said. You either ready or you ain't. Silence stretched as Tyrone sat there, letting the weight of it settle. Then, slowly, he nodded, once, firm and certain. I'm ready, Tyrone said. Charles's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, satisfied. Good, Charles said, leaning back again. Then let's get to work. End of part 3. Final line to echo in next part, then let's get to work. Chapter 11, Ashes and Embers, Part 4, A New Flame. Summary: Tyrone quietly begins rebuilding his life, preparing for fatherhood and his future in the trucking business. He works hard, focused, determined not to repeat the past. Then let's get to work. The days that followed moved differently. There were no sirens, no shadows watching from parked cars, no whispered threats from the corners. It was just work, hard, steady, honest work. Tyrone kept his head down, clocking in early, staying late, learning every inch of the business, from routes to maintenance, from invoices to licensing. Charles didn't coddle him. He didn't make it easy, but Tyrone didn't want easy. He wanted something that lasted. Marie watched him from the doorway some evenings as he sat at the kitchen table, scribbling in a small, battered notebook, mapping out routes, jotting down expenses, budgeting every dollar. She never interrupted. Sometimes she'd just bring him a cup of tea, setting it down without a word, watching him work with quiet pride, her hand resting on her belly. Tyrone barely noticed the bruises on his knuckles fading. He barely noticed how far the streets had drifted behind him. All he cared about now was the notebook in front of him. Each line he wrote down wasn't just numbers or plans. It was a step forward. It was proof. Late one night, after Marie had gone to bed, Tyrone sat alone, flipping through the pages, his pen tapping lightly against the paper. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not wide, not cocky, just real, quiet, grounded. He set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and stared out the window at the dark city beyond. He wasn't the same man who walked those streets. He wasn't running anymore. He was building, brick by brick, word by word. His eyes drifted back to the notebook, its pages already filling fast. And in the quiet, steady night, Tyrone spoke softly to himself. No bravado, no audience, just truth. This time, he murmured, a small spark in his chest. I'm building something that don't burn down. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12, Crown Heavy, Part 1, The Day of Days. Summary: Tyrone waits at the hospital while Marie goes into labor. The room fills with quiet tension, family friction, and the weight of everything that's led to this moment. The fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the worn chairs and muted blue walls. Tyrone sat near the window, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles whitened. His leg bounced uncontrollably, the nerves hitting harder than any fight, any street corner, any deal gone wrong. This was a different kind of fear, the kind he couldn't fight his way through. Marie was in labor. He'd been pacing earlier, but the nurse's sharp look pinned him down, leaving him stuck in that chair, watching the hallway like it might spit out answers if he stared hard enough. Santiago and Rosa sat a few seats away. Rosa was quiet, rosary beads slipping between her fingers as she mumbled soft prayers under her breath. Santiago sat stiff, arms crossed, staring ahead, his jaw tight. But he was here. That meant something. The tension between them still hung in the air, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was tired, worn, stripped down by everything they'd all survived. Then the door opened. Charles walked in, calm as ever, his face unreadable, but his presence heavy. He wasn't here to make noise. He was here to stand watch. Tyrone's eyes met his for just a second, and Charles gave the smallest nod. steady, grounding. Then Charles leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed, saying nothing. They waited together. The minutes stretched long and slow, marked only by Rose's soft whispers and the distant sound of footsteps down the hall. Nobody spoke, but everything was understood. This was the day everything changed. This was the day they'd all been walking toward, through fire, through blood, through fear, and now there was no going back. End of part 1. Chapter 12, Crown Heavy, Part 2, A New King. Summary: Tyrone is called into the delivery room as Marie gives birth. He faces his greatest fear, fatherhood, and meets his son for the first time, forever changed. There was no going back. The door swung open and a nurse stepped out, her face calm but urgent. "Tyrone Reed?" she asked, scanning the room. Tyrone shot up so fast the chair nearly toppled behind him. "Yeah," he said, his voice tight. "She's ready," the nurse said with a quick nod. "Let's go." His legs felt heavy, but somehow he moved, following her down the hallway, every step pounding like a drumbeat in his ears. Behind him, he felt their eyes. Santiago's hard stare, Rosa's tearful prayers, Charles's steady, silent watch. But he didn't look back. He had only one focus now. They reached the door, the nurse pushing it open. Inside, everything felt brighter, sharper. Marie lay on the bed, her face flushed and damp with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead. She was breathing hard, gripping the sides of the bed with white-knuckled fists. But when her eyes met Tyrone's, something steadied inside both of them. "You ready?" she panted, her voice weak but fiery. Tyrone swallowed hard and stepped to her side, grabbing her hand tight. "I'm here," he said, his voice low but certain. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed, calm but focused, barking instructions that blurred in Tyrone's head. "Push, Marie. Deep breaths. Let's go." Tyrone's heart raced, but he didn't let go. He whispered to her over and over as she gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. "You got this, baby," Tyrone said, his voice cracking as he squeezed her hand tighter. "I'm right here. I ain't going nowhere," Marie screamed, her whole body straining. The room spun, the walls closing in, but Tyrone kept his focus on her face, her strength, the life they were bringing into the world. Then, suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air, high, loud, alive. Tyrone froze. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as he watched the doctor lift the tiny, wriggling body. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, her voice steady but warm. The nurses moved fast, cleaning and swaddling the baby, but Tyrone couldn't look away. That was his son. His. One of the nurses looked at him, smiling faintly. "You want to hold him?" she asked, holding out the bundle. Tyrone's hands shook as he reached out, his chest tight, his breath stuck in his throat. But when she placed the baby in his arms, small, warm, perfect, everything else fell away. Tyrone stared down at the tiny face, the wide eyes blinking slowly, the small fist curling in the blanket. Tears burned in his eyes before he could stop them. He looked at Marie, who was smiling weakly, exhausted but glowing. "Tyrone Jr.," she whispered, her voice soft but sure. Tyrone let out a shaky breath, staring at his son. He'd been shot at, beaten, tested, broken, but nothing had ever made him feel this kind of fear or this kind of love. In that moment, holding his son, Tyrone understood everything Charles had ever told him. This was his crown now, and it was heavy. End of part 2. Final line to echo in next part. This was his crown now, and it was heavy. Chapter 12, Crown Heavy, Part 3, Family Circle. Summary: Tyrone introduces his son to the family. The moment softens even the hardest hearts, including Santiago's. Charles offers Tyrone a few final words of wisdom about the weight of fatherhood. This was his crown now, and it was heavy. Tyrone stepped out into the waiting room, his arms wrapped tight around the tiny bundle in his chest. Everything else, the beeping machines, the chatter of nurses, even his own heartbeat, faded as he walked in. The family stood as soon as they saw him. Rosa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. Santiago's face shifted, his hard expression breaking just slightly as his gaze locked on the baby. Charles remained leaning against the wall, quiet but watching closely. Tyrone walked slowly, steady despite the weight in his arms, stopping just a few feet in front of them. "Meet Tyrone Jr.," Tyrone said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Rosa stepped forward first, her hands trembling as she touched the baby's tiny hand. "Mi Dios," she whispered, crying openly now. "So beautiful." Santiago didn't move at first. He stood there, his arms crossed, staring long and hard, but not at Tyrone, at the child. Slowly he stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing through the quiet room. Without a word, he reached out, just a finger, and brushed it against the baby's cheek. The newborn squirmed slightly, letting out a soft noise, but remained calm. Santiago's face softened even more, his eyes shining despite himself. He looked up at Tyrone, his voice low, rough, but steady. "You take care of that boy," Santiago said, his tone stripped of all his usual anger. "Don't ever let him go." Tyrone nodded, his throat tight. "I won't," he promised. Then, in a gesture no one expected, not even him, Santiago extended his hand. Tyrone looked at it, stunned for a second. Then he shifted the baby in one arm and shook Santiago's hand with the other, firm, solid, respect earned, not given. Rosa beamed, wiping her tears as she watched the moment unfold. Charles finally stepped forward, his presence commanding but quiet. He didn't say much. He just looked at the baby, then back at Tyrone, his voice a low rumble that carried deep. "You a king now, too," Charles said, his eyes steady. "But it's a heavy crown." He placed a hand firmly on Tyrone's shoulder, squeezing once, hard enough to let it sink in. "Don't forget that," Charles added, his gaze locked. "Wear it right." Tyrone swallowed hard but nodded, the words carving themselves into him. "I will," Tyrone said, his voice certain. The weight in his arms felt heavier now, but it wasn't a burden. It was purpose. End of part 3. Final line to echo in next part, it was purpose. Chapter 12, Crown Heavy Part 4, King of 5. Summary: Tyrone takes his first steps into his new life, running his own trucking business with his family by his side. He's no longer running from the past, he's driving toward the future. It was purpose. Weeks later, the lot looked different, but maybe that was just how Tyrone saw it now. The same old pavement, the same rumble of engines, the same city skyline stretching wide in the distance. But this time, he wasn't just standing in the lot. He was standing next to his truck, his. Parked near the far end, gleaming under the sun, the rig bore his name on the side in bold letters. Reed Freight. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was his. Charles stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with that quiet look of approval, though his hands were already slipping into his pockets like he was ready to step back and let Tyrone handle his own weight. "You sure you're ready for this?" Charles asked, his voice rough but faintly amused. Tyrone glanced at him, a steady smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I've been ready," Tyrone said. Charles gave a slow nod, his eyes crinkling faintly at the corners. "Then stop talking," Charles said, his voice warm but firm. "Go work." Marie stood at the edge of the lot, holding Tyrone Jr. in her arms, their son bundled against her chest, eyes wide as he took in the world around him. She smiled softly, her gaze locked on Tyrone. Tyrone looked back at her, the weight of everything they'd been through sitting steady in his chest, but it didn't pull him down. It lifted him. He climbed up into the cab, settling into the seat like he'd been born there, his hands firm on the wheel, the engine already humming with quiet power. This wasn't the end. This wasn't the finish line. This was the first mile. As he eased the truck into gear and rolled out of the lot, he glanced into the rearview mirror, watching his family shrink in the distance. And with a quiet, steady breath, he spoke under his breath, words meant only for himself. "This ain't the end," Tyrone murmured. a small, determined smile crossing his face as he drove into the rising sun. This just the first mile. End of chapter 12. End of King of 5.